Welcome to Chess Edge. Here I'll be teaching about all you need to know to train your chess practical skills. I'll be teaching about the thinking algorithm of a player, calculation of variations, and most of all teaching you guys how to use the theory you have studied from your books and courses. The first couple of lessons will be about the thinking process. Why thinking process, one might ask? The answer to this question is simple. With a flawed thinking system, one reaches a certain level where it is extremely difficult to progress no matter how much theory they know. This may sound like an exaggeration, but you can study all openings, endings, and strategies, but still not progress because of the flawed thinking system. So without wasting too much of your time, allow me to teach you Gookie chess, the chess that will beat the guy on the screen in November. We'll study a position that occurred in one of my online games. Let's begin. The game begins with pawn to d4 and black responds with knight to f6. White continues with pawn to c4, taking more space in the center while black plays pawn to e6, preparing solid development. The knight develops to c3, and black answers with bishop to b4, pinning the knight and entering the Nimzo-Indian defense. White chooses the aggressive pawn to f3, supporting the center and preparing a strong pawn chain. Black strikes back with pawn to d5. White calmly reinforces the center with pawn to e3 and black castles kingside. Next comes pawn to a3, immediately questioning the bishop. Black exchanges with bishop takes c3 check, and after pawn takes c3, white accepts doubled pawns in return for the bishop pair. Black continues with pawn to c5, challenging the center. White responds with pawn takes d5 and black recaptures with pawn takes d5. The bishop develops to d3, black plays pawn to b6, the knight comes to e2 and black develops the bishop to a6, eyeing the important d3 bishop. White castles, bringing the king to safety. Black exchanges with bishop takes d3, and after queen takes d3, white keeps a healthy position because of a nice presence in the center and potential of a kingside attack. Black places the rook on e8, white improves the knight to g3, black develops the remaining knight to c6, and finally the bishop comes to b2, lining up on the long diagonal. Then black plays pawn to h5. This is where the position becomes interesting, and this is where I switched from simply playing moves to using my thinking algorithm. The first question is simple. Do I have a direct win? To answer that, we don't guess. We systematically examine every forcing candidate move in this order. Checks, captures, threats, pawn breaks. Only after comparing all of those do we decide whether any of them gives a real advantage. If none does, then we move on to the final question of the thinking process, which I'll cover in my next video. Let's start with the checks. There is only one. Queen to h7 check. It certainly grabs your attention, but after king takes h7, the attack simply ends. There's no follow-up, no hidden tactic, and no compensation for the queen. Now, many players would immediately cross this move off their list because it hangs the queen. I don't recommend thinking that way. Sometimes a move that looks completely insane turns out to hide a brilliant tactical idea. I've won beautiful games with sacrifices that initially looked impossible. In this position, though, queen to h7 check is simply a blunder. With checks exhausted, we move on to the captures. The first one I considered was pawn takes c5. Black replies with knight to e5, forcing the queen to f5. After pawn takes c5, white is left with a weak pawn on e3, an isolated c-pawn, and a bishop on b2 that's shut in by its own pawn structure. Nothing about that position appealed to me, so I rejected it. Another capture is knight takes h5. After knight takes h5, black simply answers with knight takes h5 and white has achieved nothing. Even though this move fails immediately, it's still worth checking. Spending a few extra seconds to verify an obvious-looking idea is much better than overlooking the one tactical exception that could win the game. With no promising checks or captures, it was time to examine the pawn breaks. There was only one that made real strategic sense. Pawn to e4. This immediately challenges the center and opens lines for white's pieces. Black has several reasonable responses, but none of them creates serious problems for white. If black chooses pawn takes e4, white responds with pawn takes e4. After pawn to h4, the knight jumps to f5, increasing the pressure. Should black continue with pawn takes d4, the knight captures on g7. If black gets greedy with king takes g7, white simply recaptures with pawn takes d4, opening the center while creating a dangerous kingside attack with multiple threats against the exposed king. Instead, black's stronger continuation is knight to e5. But even then, after queen to h3, king takes g7, pawn takes d4, knight to c4, pawn to e5, knight to h7, rook to f4, knight to g5, and queen to g4, white's pieces flood toward the kingside and black's king comes under tremendous pressure. Another possibility for black is pawn to h4. Again, the knight heads to f5. After pawn to c4, queen to d2, knight to e7, knight takes e7 check, rook takes e7, and finally pawn to e5, white obtains a beautiful position. White enjoys more space, active pieces, and the bishop on b2 is ready to reroute to a far more dangerous diagonal. Black can also answer pawn to e4 with pawn to c4. After queen to e3, pawn takes e4, pawn takes e4, pawn to h4, knight to f5, and knight takes e4, white continues with queen to f3. If black tries knight to d2, there's a tactical shot. Knight to h6 check. After pawn takes h6, queen takes f7 check, king to h8, rook to f6, queen takes f6, and queen takes f6 check, white wins material. Instead, black's better move is queen to f6, white simply develops with rook to d1. Even though white is a pawn down, every piece is active, black's king is uncomfortable, and I actually preferred white's position because of the overwhelming activity on the king side. I also look for direct threats. There is one worth mentioning. Queen to b5. It looks active, but after pawn to h4, knight to f5, queen to d7, the pawn to e4, pawn takes e4, pawn takes e4, rook takes e4, pawn takes c5, pawn to a6, queen to b3, and pawn takes c5, black simply wins a pawn without giving white enough compensation. So after comparing every forcing candidate move, none of them produced a clear tactical win. That led me to choose a quieter move in the game. Rook to e1, preparing the powerful pawn to e4 break on the next move. Looking back, pawn to e4 immediately was probably the strongest move objectively, but my choice still kept all the strategic ideas alive. Black continued with pawn to h4, the knight jumped to f5, black pushed pawn to h3, and after pawn to g4 the attack was underway. From there, the initiative never slipped away, and I converted the advantage into a win on move 26.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. But if you aren't ready to improve, you can leave without subscribing and go back to studying your engine lines that will run out by move 15. Before leaving, I'd like to ask you guys to look for the book, Cognitive Chess, and the Manual of Chess Combinations, volumes 1A to 3. These books are aimed at training your visualization and calculation, the two most important skills in the type of chess that I'm teaching to you. If you have any chess-related questions, don't shy away from asking. I'll be ready with a video reply. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.